Welcome to session 5.3. We're going to start on page 298 with a visual overview, and we'll basically pick up where we left off in the last video, which is the Atlantic cod um, data. And we have the slicer up here, and here we have our list of customers and so on. I'm going to save this as a different file name, so you'll be able to take a look at this file and see the difference between 5.1 and 5.2. In the last videos, if you remember, we created a table, which looks like this, but in this video, instead of creating a table, we're going to create a pivot table. Okay, so a pivot table is a really powerful tool. It allows you to do some really amazing analysis, and your data doesn't necessarily have to be in a table like this. So what I did is I took our fish sales table and I converted it back just to regular data. And you'll notice how at the top I no longer have the selection boxes of the table, and I'm just back to the regular information. Same way as when we started off in video 1. So to create a pivot table, what I'm going to do is select the data, or I could select the entire sheet depending on what I want to do, and I'll press Insert Pivot Table. And it's going to say select the range, so we've done that already, and it's put the range in of the copy sheet. And it's going to say, where do you want to put the pivot table? Do you want to put on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet? For example, we could press existing worksheet, select the location, and just pop it in on this sheet. But normally, we'd want to put it onto a new sheet so we could see what's going on. It just depends on how you're going to utilize the pivot table. So we'll press OK, and we get a sheet like this. You'll notice now that we are on sheet 2, which is a new sheet it created. Here we have the pivot table 1, and on the right-hand side we have a list of all the fields, and it's pulling these from our headers across the top. Okay, it's important that the data table is filled in, so there's no gaps or spaces, and every column has a header. If a column didn't have a header, then it wouldn't work properly. Okay, now you'll notice when we go back to our pivot table that these are all our fields, and we have 4 areas: filter, columns, rows, and values. Okay, so what that basically means is if we look at a chart that has 2 axes, okay, I'll throw in a paint document. So basically our chart is going to look like this. We could have one set of values going on one side and one going on the other side. So basically, in our case, we could, let's say, have customer by type of fish. Sorry, that didn't work properly. Or we could have any of this other data, right? It just depends on how we want to organize them. Or we could reverse them to have like type of fish by customer. And there's many other possibilities. The most important thing to remember when we're building pivot tables is to make sure that the data in them actually looks normal. You know, it doesn't have a weird formatting, or there isn't so much detail that it's impossible to understand what the chart is trying to tell us. So let's start off simply. Let's take fish purchased, and we'll drop that into columns. So it's going to give us cod, halibut, salmon across the top. We could also take fish purchased and put it into rows, so we get it going the other way. Okay, and let's do a simple analysis. We'll look at fish purchased on rows, and we'll talk about payment method in the columns. So basically, it's going to show us the type of fish here, and then it looks cash, credit, debit, and grand total going the other side. Okay, we'll automatically size it. Now you'll notice that we just clicked on here and dragged in the tabs, but it didn't give us any numbers. The table didn't get filled out. So we have to decide what we're going to put under values, right? Like what we're going to count. What's this show? Like what's this going to say? So in our case, fish purchased is going to be the same as the information that we're interested in. So these numbers will basically say that for cod, 5 people paid in cash, 6 people paid credit, 6 debit, and a total 17 people altogether bought cod, right? And we have totals going the other way too, so we have 8 people in total paid with cash, 12 with credit, and 10 with debit, and this is how it was divided up. So you'll notice, like, say here, that nobody purchased halibut using debit card, right? And we're also able to grab these charts and, the tables, and very quickly build build a chart based off the data that we come up with, but it's certainly possible to move these around. So let's look at another example. So using our same data, we'll just move it back up there to get rid of it. Okay, so in this case, let's take a look at fish purchased. And we'll look at fish purchased. Let's put it over here. And we'll look at previous year. Okay, so does that necessarily tell us something we want to know? It creates a huge table, but that's not really super useful. Why don't we look at customer name? Let's try that. So we have a lot of customers. And now we could throw in purchase amount. Nope, that doesn't make sense. Okay, so let's look at it like this. So we'll start again from the beginning. We'll put in customer name. So these are all our customers. And now we're going to put in store location, also in rows under customer name. Now you'll notice that for the first one, for Ashanti Eubanks, it underneath is Fredericton, and then it will give us a total for that person. We can also close these to summarize our data. So for example, if one customer shopped at multiple stores, they would list each one here. Now is the perfect place for us to put in our totals, or we could put in our, let's do a simple one. We'll do payment method. Okay, so it's going to tell us that for each of these people by location and payment method, we'll use payment method as our value. Then we'll get a list. So this is already getting a little complicated. The other thing I want to tell you is if you look over here, it says count of payment method. Basically, how many times was credit used and how many times was cash or debit, etc. And that's what these numbers mean. Now, because in our case, each person only made one payment using one method, they're all just going to be ones, but theoretically, it could be a bunch of numbers and then total them up here at the side. We can also click here and go to where it says value field settings and change to, do we want count, like counting the number of times one of these payment methods was used, or we could add up all the numbers together, average, min, max, etc., and that will be what's built up in our table. Okay, now we could also reverse these, so we could change customer name by store location. So here you could see that if we close all these up, we get our 3 stores. So we have Fredericton, Moncton, and Sussex, and this is the totals. These 3 columns are the totals of how our payments were made. And then we can open them up and see how individual customers paid. So right away, I could tell you if I grab this table and I put in a chart, it will show me that for cash, Fredericton didn't have any cash payments, but Moncton and Sussex did. For credit, most people in Fredericton pay with credit, but they didn't pay with credit at all in Sussex. So this is like a really quick way to analyze the data, just depending on how we organize our pieces. Now they can get very complicated, depending on what we're looking at, but as long as we keep it simple, this will help us really quickly organize our data, and it will allow us to see trends that we wouldn't necessarily be able to see otherwise, So in this case, assuming that cash or debit would be the cheapest way to accept a payment and credit would cost more money, we try to figure out, like, what can we change in Fredericton to, change it? Should we offer a discount to all these clients, except for Julia Simmons, who paid with debit? Or maybe in other locations, like in Moncton, it's more even and there's less of a pattern. So, we'd want to figure out why this is happening in one store versus this pattern in another store. And we can more easily see that than looking through this data, even if we're going back and using our filters. This could still be a much faster way to build the analysis, and then from here build a chart or a table to do it. But it's important to be cognizant of what these elements are. Okay, and here we added in one more thing called filters that you see right up here at the top. And a filter, we use store location. Columns, we use payment method. That goes across here. And rows, we use the type of fish purchased. Now, what this first one, filters, does is it creates a drop-down at the top that lets us pick, do we want to see the data for Fredericton only, or do we want to see Moncton only, and so on. And this is very similar to what we just learned about filters previously when we built our slicer here on the side. This is essentially the same principle. So we could choose to see all, and it would give us all of our data depending on how we want to divide it. So instead of store location as a filter, if we want to use, let's say, customer name, it would give us a drop down of all the customer names, and then we could see the data just for that one person. So right away it would tell you that this customer paid with credit and purchased COD. But again, if we had multiple purchase records for each customer, this could reveal trends within customers, also within types of fish, also with store locations and payment method. So we'd be able to develop patterns and try to do an analysis with a lot more detail. Now we're able to combine some of the things that we've already learned together. Like for example, I could highlight the table, and this is my pivot table options, and go to where it says pivot table tool designs on the ribbon bar. And I could pick different layouts. I could pick different options, how to format it. I can also go to analyze and press insert slice, which will insert a slicer just like we had before. And this will let us pick which ones we want. So I'm going to pick, let's say, fish purchased, and that's going to give me a slicer for the pivot table. So we're able to control the information in the pivot table, which is currently doing a multivariate analysis automatically based on the options that we select. Okay, so the table will update based on what you click on the slicer using these options here. Which means if we wanted to, let's say, look at sales information by date, if we wanted to grab different information, we would be able to do that easily, and it would be able to summarize the data from a table. Okay, so right now we're taking a look at page 314, and obviously when we go through this process, we have to figure out like what our axis is going to be and what we're going to evaluate. Of course, putting them in different orders and picking different locations, different items could obviously greatly change how the thing looks and what data it's telling us. So a way to simplify this process could be to go back to our data and press where it says recommended pivot tables. And this is going to give us the sum of purchase amount, previous year. It basically is going to take some of those data, some of these columns, and try to figure out what we're looking for. So for example, in this one, it's going to give us store location by previous year, or store location by payment method by purchase amount, which is this year's total, and many other options. So if we go through it, this could perhaps help us pick one option, or we could do it manually like we did before and choose our options by just going through and picking the variables that we want and dropping them down into value rows and columns. Again, we have to manually decide what we want to count and what the data we're going to analyze together is going to be. And of course, we could add multiple combinations as well, just depending on what we're looking for. Okay, a couple other important features. Under Analyze for the pivot table, if you have the pivot table selected, you'll see Refresh. And this will allow you to go and refresh the data if you changed it on the page and it doesn't automatically update. We could also click on Choose Source Data and change the source if we want to change the location or size of the table. For example, if we add more rows, then we'd go up here and it would allow us to add more rows into our analysis. So to create a chart, we have the Pivot Chart button, and that would allow us to quickly create a chart based on whatever our pivot table is looking at. And there's many different options. It really just depends on what you're trying to come up with. Okay, or as I showed you before, you could just select the entire table, go to Insert, you could use Recommended Charts, and pick one from here as well. It pretty much does the same thing. It's also possible to remove these headings, and it's possible to build filters into the chart, which we can't normally do, that would allow you to select or deselect certain pieces of data to only display, this is salmon and cod versus all types of fish in this one. So it just depends on what you want to do. You could also go into, I believe it's pivot chart options, and turn off those labels as well, just depending on how you want it to look. For the charts themselves, we also have filters where we could select different variables, or we can go back and just completely open it up and this would allow, and then this would automatically update, and we'd be able to, link these diagrams to our pivot table, which are in turn linked to these. It would be a lot more difficult if we were to take this data and then put in a chart. It would get a lot more complicated because we wouldn't be able to as accurately predict what the or put in what the axes are supposed to be. Whereas here, because we're using a summary of the data, it makes it a lot simpler. We could, for example, slice it and then have this work off of our tables, as you can see here. So they're automatically going to update on whatever we put in as our selection criteria. And that is basically pivot tables. So I hope this was a good overview of pivot tables and slicers. I highly recommend take the data set and play around with it. It's an incredibly powerful tool, both as we talked about tables itself, as well as using pivot tables, because it allows you to very quickly summarize data and find new ways to look at it. And I'll give you an example. I worked with an organization that did an analysis using a pivot table on kids that came to a after school program. And until they realized this, they weren't really able to plot gender by age and find out what age did kids start to come and stop to come, and then compare by gender. And they found that it's interesting that boys started coming younger but left the program younger, where girls started coming to the program older and stayed longer in the program. And then once they had this data and they were able to look at thousands of different pieces of information and compare them, they figured out a trend, and then they could look into why is this happening? What do we have to do to change it? So it gives you a lot of versatility when you're looking at relationships between variables, obviously ones that make sense, and that gives you a very good idea, a good place to start from, as well as a really good way to make data summaries, which is highly recommended. So I recommend go through the pivot tables, learn this chapter really, really well, especially 5.3, and this will give you a huge advantage when you're working on displaying data and presenting it using a pivot table.